After the final thunder of World War II faded, while the world still lay in ashes, the United States rose like a triumphant titan. It had crushed fascism, wielded the atomic bomb, commanded millions of soldiers, and possessed the most powerful military-industrial complex ever known. In that moment, America believed in its own invincibility, that no war on earth could stand against its might. So when it stepped into Vietnam, Washington saw it not as a real war, but as a manageable, limited conflict, a small-scale campaign to preserve the post-war order it had built. The American generals, veterans of Korea and Europe, carried an unshakable faith in firepower. They believed that technology and overwhelming force could solve any military problem. Find and destroy, they said, that was the mantra of the Pentagon. They unleashed the B-52 bombers, the Huey helicopters, artillery, radar, and electronic warfare, the full machinery of modern war. Each night, the skies over Vietnam blazed with flares and explosions, as if the light of Western technology itself were burning away the jungle darkness. But behind that blinding light was a shadow America could not see. They did not understand their enemy. They didn't understand how a small, poor nation, devastated by decades of conflict, could keep fighting year after year. They didn't understand that the Vietnamese were not merely defending land, they were defending freedom and identity, things no bomb could destroy. From Saigon, reports flowed back to Washington. "We are winning," claimed General Westmoreland. Enemy body counts climbed, red zones on the map shrank. By every metric of conventional warfare, victory seemed certain. Yet the deeper American forces advanced, the less ground they truly held. They captured a village by day, only to lose it again by night. Every jungle path, every river, every hamlet seemed to swallow their strength whole. America measured success with numbers. Bombs dropped, enemies killed, territory taken. But it could not measure the will of a people. Beneath the charts and statistics, a new kind of war was taking shape. A war where the battlefield was fluid, invisible, and psychological. A war in which the mightiest army in the world was fighting an opponent it could not see and a cause it could not comprehend. So what could make the greatest military power in history bow before a small nation on the other side of the world? The answer lies not in firepower or strategy, but in the illusion of power itself. The illusion that technology can replace understanding, that force can conquer conviction, and that illusion would lead America down a long, painful road from arrogance to exhaustion and ultimately to defeat.
The jungle is not a place on a map, it is a teacher with a cruel curriculum. Imagine a doctrine built for highways and front lines, for airfields and artillery barrages. Then imagine forcing that doctrine into an ever-changing web of paths, hamlets, and tunnels, where the enemy melts away like mist at dawn. This was the fatal mismatch. America's search and destroy logic collided with a war that refused to be shaped by grids and body counts. The guerrillas were rarely where the Americans expected them to be. They were where the Americans least wanted to look. At the operational level, the problem is deceptively simple. Industrial warfare relies on concentration. Concentrate firepower, concentrate mobility, concentrate logistics. The U.S. brought concentration, helicopters, B-52s, armored columns, and expected the same calculus to apply. What met them instead was dispersion. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces dispersed into villages, into forests, into networks of tunnels and rice paddies that turned every ordinary lane into a potential ambush. Each road, each hamlet, each market became what one analyst later called a soft battlefield, terrain that could be claimed during daylight by a patrolling platoon and reclaimed by nightfall by fighters who knew the ground as if it were their own skin. The ingenuity of that approach was not merely tactical, but psychological. Conventional commanders measure success in territory held and enemy bodies counted. Insurgents measure success in survival, attrition of will, and the extension of effort. Guerrillas traded pitched battles for friction. They bored into the seams of the American system, supply lines, patrol patterns, the confidence of troops and commanders who had been trained to see decisive engagements, not endless attritional conflict. Over time, the calculus shifted. The U.S. could inflict terrible localized damage, but it could not turn that damage into sustainable political control. Meanwhile, every small victory the guerrillas won, the successful ambush, the village returned to their influence, a resupply corridor kept open, fed a larger strategic momentum that no bomber could erase. To understand how this worked, you must look down rather than up. The Cu Chi tunnels offer a compact lesson in insurgent adaptation. They were not simple holes. They were a subterranean city, living quarters, workshops, hospitals, command nodes. From those narrow corridors, fighters could vanish underfoot as American patrols swept the ground 3 meters above. The tunnels were the physical embodiment of a doctrine of appear, strike, vanish. From a distance, U.S. aerial reconnaissance and firepower saw only canopy and clearing. Beneath, an entire war economy breathed. That asymmetric intimacy, knowing when to show strength and when to dissolve into the populace, turned material superiority into a logistical and moral problem for the invader. This pattern, seize by day, seed by night, also rewired the local population's calculus. Control was not a binary stamped on a map, it was a daily negotiation. Civic authority could be coaxed or coerced, hearts and minds swung with 1,000 small interactions. American forces could bring food and medical teams to a village for a week, but if guerrillas returned once the patrols left, the political advantage evaporated. The durability of insurgent influence lay in persistence rather than spectacle, patient governance, local justice, and the ability to absorb losses while keeping the network intact. Perhaps the most revealing line is deceptively modest. We do not need to win every battle, we only need to make you lose a little more each day. That sentence captures the strategic patience of an insurgency. It rejects the binary measure of victory in favor of cumulative erosion. For a democracy far from home, fighting a war that would be measured not in territory held, but in the wearing down of public resolve at home, that slow drip was lethal. Every ambush that cost a soldier's life, every village that quietly slipped back to guerrilla influence, every night patrol that returned empty-handed, accumulated into political weight. In Washington, headlines and opinion shifted. At home, the appetite for indefinite incremental loss waned. In the end, the lesson is stark. Industrial power can break things quickly, but it cannot always hold what it breaks. Against an adversary organized around endurance, local knowledge, and the ability to make the battlefield as fluid as a rumor, firepower becomes a tool with diminishing strategic returns. The insurgent tactic turned American strength into a liability by reframing the objective. The war ceased to be about decisive engagements and became instead a daily tax on will, and in that currency the invader ran bankrupt.
The night of the Tet Offensive, January 30th, 1968, was not just a military operation, it was a psychological earthquake. Across South Vietnam, from bustling provincial capitals to quiet hamlets, coordinated attacks erupted simultaneously. The streets of Saigon, normally festive with the Lunar New Year, became scenes of confusion and alarm. Helicopters screamed overhead, gunfire cracked through the early hours, and the shockwaves of explosives rattled even the most fortified compounds. Perhaps the most iconic strike was the assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. For Americans, the embassy had been a symbol of security, a physical and psychological stronghold. The sight of Viet Cong fighters scaling walls and engaging U.S. personnel inside the compound shattered the myth of invulnerability. Broadcast images, captured by journalists in real time, pierced American living rooms, turning abstract casualty reports into vivid, undeniable proof that the enemy could reach the heart of American power. Strategically, the Tet Offensive was costly for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, who suffered heavy casualties and lost many experienced cadres. Yet the psychological and symbolic impact far outweighed the material losses. For the American public and global observers, the narrative of a war nearing a clean, decisive victory collapsed. Headlines in U.S. newspapers questioned everything. If this is victory, what would defeat look like? Public opinion in the United States shifted almost overnight. Citizens who had once trusted official pronouncements and supported continued escalation began to doubt the feasibility of winning. Anti-war demonstrations swelled, editors demanded accountability, and politicians faced increasing pressure. The Tet Offensive did not produce a strategic defeat for American forces in conventional terms, but it eroded confidence, legitimacy, and political will, marking a turning point in the war. On the ground in Vietnam, ordinary citizens witnessed both courage and tragedy. Homes and markets were transformed into battlegrounds, and yet amidst the destruction, life persisted. Families fled, soldiers regrouped, and villages tried to maintain daily routines. The contrast between physical sacrifice and strategic perception illustrated a harsh reality of modern asymmetric warfare. Victory is not measured solely in territory or enemy killed, but in the will of societies and the resilience of populations. In essence, Tet 1968 was more than an offensive. It was a mirror held up to the superpower, reflecting vulnerability, overconfidence, and the limits of technological and industrial dominance when faced with a determined, unconventional adversary. The reverberations would shape U.S. strategy, domestic politics, and the collective psyche for years to come, proving that in warfare, psychological impact can eclipse even the heaviest of losses.
The American home front had transformed into a battlefield of perception as rows of flag-draped coffins returned from Southeast Asia. The human cost of the war became undeniable. Streets and campuses filled with anti-war protesters, students marching with banners, artists staging impromptu performances, even veterans adding their voices to the growing chorus of dissent. The war, once a distant narrative of strategy and body counts, now arrived in living rooms through television broadcasts, raw, immediate, and impossible to ignore. For the first time in history, Americans saw the brutal realities of a foreign conflict unfolding before their eyes. Explosions, smoke, and the faces of soldiers caught in chaos were no longer confined to newspapers. They flickered across screens in millions of homes, turning abstract numbers into visceral human tragedy. Public opinion, once molded by carefully crafted official statements, began to shift rapidly. Headlines questioned policy. Editorial pages demanded accountability. Ordinary citizens debated the legitimacy of continued escalation. The political leadership felt the pressure. Generals like Westmoreland, whose strategy relied on attrition and measurable military victories, faced skepticism. President Johnson's credibility eroded as citizens wondered whether the endless costs abroad were worth the proclaimed gains.
The distance between military assessment and public sentiment grew dangerously wide. By 1969, the shift was formalized. President Nixon introduced what became known as the Nixon Doctrine, signaling a strategic withdrawal and the policy of Vietnamization. American forces would gradually pull back, leaving South Vietnamese troops to assume greater responsibility for their own defense. The doctrine marked not just a change in battlefield tactics, but a profound reversal of initiative, from an unchallenged superpower dictating the pace of war to a nation reacting to domestic dissent and psychological strain. The lesson was clear. In modern conflict, controlling the narrative at home can be as decisive as controlling territory abroad. The war had migrated from jungles and rice paddies into living rooms, classrooms, and public squares, where perception, outrage, and fatigue became weapons that no army could counter with firepower alone. The battlefield had expanded beyond Vietnam into the minds and hearts of the American people.
The lesson of Vietnam is not found in bomb craters or scorched jungles, but in the hearts and minds of those who endured. The United States, armed with the most sophisticated weaponry and the most extensive logistics of its era, confronted an adversary whose strength could not be measured in tons of explosives or rows of tanks. What they faced was a nation galvanized by identity, by history, and by an unyielding desire for self-determination. It was a confrontation not of arms alone, but of will and understanding. Industrial might, precision strikes, and overwhelming firepower could break structures, destroy vehicles, and inflict casualties, yet they could not conquer resolve. Every village held, every tunnel network that persisted, every citizen quietly supporting the struggle was a silent testament to an intangible force that no military manual could quantify. For historians, strategists, and policymakers, the war became a case study in the limits of conventional superiority. The American experience in Vietnam underscores a timeless principle. Military power, divorced from cultural insight and respect for national determination, is inherently fragile. In the end, the so-called superpower learned a lesson repeated throughout history, that the human element, the courage of a people defending their homeland and ideals, can outweigh even the most formidable arsenal. And so, as the final helicopters departed and the headlines told of withdrawal rather than triumph, the world saw a paradox. The greatest military force of the 20th century humbled not by another army of equal strength, but by the steadfastness of a smaller, determined nation. The closing reflection remains. True power lies not in destruction, but in the resilience and unity of a people who refuse to yield. It is this understanding that no weapon can surpass the yearning for freedom that marks the defining lesson of history. The final words echo across generations. And that was the moment in history when the largest military power bowed to the will of a small but indomitable nation.